Welcome to the Emerald Doorway Podcast. We explore magic and occultism through various mediums: art, music, film, books. If you're listening on YouTube, please press the like and follow button. Skidoo. What man is at ease in his inn? Get out. Wide is the world and cold. Get out. Thou hast become an initiate. Get out. Thou canst not get out by the way thou camest in. The way out is the way. Aleister Crowley, the 23rd chapter from the Book of Lies. Around 1960, William S. Burroughs was living in Tangier. He was chasing young boys, hashish, and dragons, and wrestling with various beasts, including his conscience and his pen. He was also exploring the magical undercurrents of Morocco, as magic was always a vital part of his life and identity. One day, Burroughs met a sea captain named Captain Clark. The captain had bragged that in 23 years he never once had a boating accident. By some strange form of chance or twist of fate, Captain Clark would come to wreck his boat later that evening. The same evening, Burroughs had heard over the radio about an airplane crash off the coast of Florida. Flight 23, mysteriously piloted by another Captain Clark, had crashed and killed 23 people. 23, 23, 23, 23. Burroughs was now the victim of a strange and irreversible curse that would follow him for the rest of his life. He would see the number 23 everywhere. He would look at a clock, and the minute hand was always lighted on 23. He would go to funerals and have to sit through the 23rd Psalm from the Bible. He found deeper connections between the number 23 and everyday life and the universe all around him. This phenomenon became known as the 23 Enigma. A decade or so later, Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea, co-authors of the Illuminatus trilogy, would go on to be influenced by the number. As did musicians like Genesis P. Origin, David Tibet, and various occult groups like the Discordians, TOPY, and IoT. Chaos magicians began to equate the number with the goddess Eris. The 23rd current of magic was born. My guest tonight, Michael Magickman, was both a former member of TOPY and the Golden Dawn. Michael is a real Renaissance man. He's always learning new hobbies and trades. He's an engineer, a painter, writer, musician, silk screener of t-shirts, gardener, botanist, and occultist, and to me, very much a shaman. I first became acquainted with Michael nearly a decade ago when we made a podcast about Brian Geison's Dream Machine. We kept in touch over the years, and he became closer as a friend and confidant. We really got to know each other well when I went to visit his house on the East Coast in the summer of 2020 following the pandemic. There, through a mysterious and life-altering rite of passage, he introduced me to 5-MeO-DMT, more commonly known as Toad DMT. That evening, I had a clear vision of being visited by a seraphim angel with many wings and countless eyes, ruby red in color and aura. The angel took much of my pain and trauma away and set me on a course of healing that still continues to this day. The following evening, we took some medical-grade acid, stared into Michael's self-built dream machine for hours, and went on a long walk to look at a tunnel covered in beautiful graffiti. About a year later, I went to visit Michael again, and this time we tried out a few different psychedelic mushroom strains. That summer, I had begun speaking long distance to a girl I had known for many years who was living back in Las Vegas, my former place of residence. Exactly 4 years ago, to the day of the premiere of this show, May 23rd, I asked that girl to be my girlfriend while staying at Michael's house. A year later, we got married. The role 23 plays in my own life is not without extreme personal and spiritual significance.
What is the 23 Enigma? Well, the 23 Enigma, did I start to sound a little like Burroughs then? I thought I did. Well, 23 Enigma. Burroughs told me about the 23 Enigma back in around 65. He had observed a lot of coincidences connected with the number 23. And as soon as he told me that, I started noticing coincidences involving the number 23. I put a lot of them into the Illuminati novels, and I put a bunch of them into the first of my Cosmic Trigger trilogy. And ever since then, I've been getting letters from people who've observed odd 23s. And there's no end to it. I'll tell you a very amusing anecdote. I was in St. Louis giving a lecture. A guy came up after the lecture with his wife and said, I figured out how your 23 gimmick works. And I said, oh, tell me. And he said, it's a neurological grid. You make your readers very conscious of 23, more conscious than they are of the other numbers. And I said, congratulations, you found the great magician who makes the grass green. That's a sign of enlightenment and Zen. Which I thought was an adequate answer. Then a little while later, it turned out we went out to have a pizza together, he and his wife and me. And one of those places where you get a number while you wait for your pizza. And of course, we got number 23. And he said to me, how do you do it? And I said, I thought you did it that time. And I suppose he's still wondering about that. Well, so am I. It just happens, that's all. It's the enigma. Why does it keep happening? A neurologic grid is part of it, but that's not all of it.
All right. Welcome to the Emerald Doorway podcast. Today we have a good friend of mine, Michael Magickman. How's it going, Michael?
Hey, how's it going? It's going to be lots of fun.
Yeah, this'll be our first episode to this new podcast I'm doing, and Michael and I have been friends for a long time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your history with magic and how you originally got into the occult and where it took you?
Okay, well, without getting too detailed about it, I got into that sort of stuff the old-fashioned way, in the sense that during the late 70s and early 80s, I was an avid player of Dungeons and Dragons, and my mom introduced me to Lord of the Rings and fantasy reading of that sort. And from there, I got very interested, of course, in everything from wizards to monsters and all that kind of stuff, and just had a general interest in it, in fairy tales and mythology. And of course, that it's just a matter of time before you start to realize that there were religions built up around some of this mythology. And I just became very interested in that, starting really as far back as around the 8th or 9th grade, I'd say. From there, well, I just got interested in the real thing, I guess you could say. I learned about ancient alchemists and the history that you can pull out of your school library, basically, and the encyclopedias and things that used to be available back when that was a thing. And from there, I just kept basically coming up with questions. It wasn't so much a philosophical thing as I was just curious as to how real it was,
Yeah, I definitely know. There's something that digs you deeper into it, because when you read into occult books, they talk of supernatural forces and gods and angels and demons and things like that, and a part of you is thinking, is this real? If I dig deeper, am I going to dig into the reality of this stuff?
Sure. And so from there, I'm trying to kind of put it into chronological order. But as I got older, I come from a military family, and so we moved a fair amount. And we moved at one point back to Washington, D.C. for a second stint. And I was a teenager. And in D.C., I had access to everything from the Library of Congress to many, Georgetown University and the Masonic libraries. And of course, there were lots of New Age stores and these sort of things. And I basically just delved as deep as I could into that, and into alternative art and music and that sort of thing.
Washington, D.C. seems like an interesting and intense place to learn about the occult. I mean, the entire town seems laid out on this kind of Masonic grid, and I can imagine that having access to Freemasonic libraries and just kind of the occult scene there would be really, really interesting.
It also had a very vibrant punk, alternative, underground, and experimental scene. And so basically there weren't a lot of rules when it came to being a teenager in the 1980s in Washington, D.C. It was just sort of a matter of what were you interested in. And so I used to see bands that I felt, at least at the time, were breaking new ground. And then from there, you could go to a record shop and get the newest imports. And of course, there's bands like Einstürze Neubauten and Throbbing Gristle and these more experimental bands that were happening then. And those records were difficult to get. So like a friend would buy one and I would buy one and somebody else would buy one, and then we would all sort of trade them around because they were a premium and we were poor little punks. And from there, it's pretty easy to start to see that symbolism. Like you said, Washington, D.C. is awash in Masonic and occult symbolism. Everything from the fads of the turn of the century, where it was a bunch of Egyptian and Greek style, which many of the monuments, of course, to the presidents are, patterned after that, to the street layout, and it's just everywhere. It's almost secondhand. And once you start to understand that language of symbols, suddenly the streets start talking to you, kind of. Yeah, by about 1985 or so, I was going to a New Age store in Georgetown that I'm pretty sure was simply called Crystals. And the store was either a front or else the staff and owner simply were affiliated with the local Golden Dawn chapter.
Oh, wow.
And so that was really one of my first bits of contact with real occultists, people that were actively parishioning to join the Golden Dawn, which I did also later on. And they were pointing me in the right direction. Here, don't read this book, read this one. This one's way better. It's more factual, that sort of thing. And so in some ways, I think I was spared a lot of wasted energy, as well as given a little bit of a leg up, because at this time I was only about 17-ish or so. And that wasn't really the sort of opportunities I think that everybody gets. Yeah. But by the time I left D.C., I had been studying under the Golden Dawn for a solid 5 years, and had gone through the first several grades. But I was such a little punk rocker that following the rules was quite difficult.
Oh yeah.
I kept wanting to strike out. And this was before chaos magic was really a vocabulary word, I guess. We didn't call it that. But through my interest in things like Throbbing Gristle and psychic television and the references that their music provided, which the stuff that they did really wasn't that original, but they'd be like, hey, have you ever heard of William S. Burroughs? And check this out. And here's his buddy Brian Geisen. And those people were quite interesting to me. And they were taking these expertly created rules that I had been taught by people like the Golden Dawn and professionally breaking them in the most amazing ways. And I got interested in the dream machine and in the cliches of TOPY, I guess you could say. And that's where my interest in eventual Curse by the number 23 came about. And it was through the temple that I basically joined a community that lasted for, I don't know, a couple decades at least. I still have tentative connections, I guess, with a few of the people, but it doesn't really exist in the same way that it used to, of course.
Of course. How old were you, and what city were you living in when you first got involved with TOPY?
I was in Washington, D.C., and I think I was right about 18 years old. From what I hear from reading the histories of it, I got into it in about September of 85 or 86. I would have to look on my paperwork to tell you if I could find such stuff. About a year after TOPY North America got started, because it originally, without going too much into the history of the organization, it was an England thing, sort of a fan club and loosely created community around psychic TV and all of these people that were doing kind of experimental music and different types of philosophy and things, trying to apply things like Crowley's OTO-based Hermeticism, directly to making art, making music, making film, making paintings, anything like this. And of course, Brian Geisen and Burroughs and stuff were just the old schools guys at this, and so we took a lot of inspiration, I guess, both covering the same ground as well as then striking out. One of the things I've always liked about the temple in general, and both Burroughs and Geisen and these people that were instrumental in my studies, is that they encourage you to actually do the thing. Don't just sit and talk about it and think about it. You can philosophize about a lot of stuff, especially when it comes to art, music, and movies and things. But it's not the same as when you actually do it.
Yeah, like when it comes to magic, you can go out and you can buy, some cup made by somebody else, a wand made by somebody else, tablets made by somebody else, but it doesn't have the same effect as if you were to create them yourself. That's a big part of the magic. Like creating the magic circle, for instance, like if you don't trace out the actual protective names yourself, if you rely on something that somebody else has written, then there's no real magic to that. There's a great deal of power that
you're missing the point of the technique, which is the personal creation. Part of what gives a piece of art, regardless of what form it takes, its significance or value, is the fact that it was made by someone. It's an expression of their will, as you would. And this is definitely true of a lot of things. For example, the Dream Machine is a very interesting little gadget. The Dream Machine is a very interesting little gadget, but you learn so much more from making one than from simply using one. You can get the visions, of course, by using one, and I can teach someone to use one in about 2 minutes. But the making of it actually takes more than a day's worth of work. I forget how many hours it was the last time I did it. But you really start to understand how it works. And when you get into the science of the flicker effect and these sort of things, it's a much more complicated thing than what the average user sees when he just sees a strobing light,
Yeah. How many dream machines have you made at this point? You've become kind of an expert on those.
Yeah, for some reason, it's not a very difficult arts and crafts project, but for some reason, as I just said, very few people actually make one. They're like, oh yeah, I saw that movie, there's a video you can watch about it. And you can see pictures of it and stuff, but if you've never been in a room with one running, you don't know anything. Yeah. And if you've never slept in a room with one running, you know even less. Because the effect that it produces is amazing. Yeah. And it's a little bit beyond just the explanation. Now, I can talk at length about alpha waves in your brain being augmented using the flicker effect. This is something you can read all kinds of scientific papers about, and everyone that is interested in the Dream Machine knows the story of how Brian Geisen fell asleep on a Greyhound bus, and the flickering sunset through the trees and telephone lines is what gave him the idea to do this. But until you make one, you don't really get it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's true with a lot of things when it comes to magic. In relation to the subject we were going to talk about later on tonight, the 23 phenomenon, until you start to look at it and actually do kind of like what I did in preparation for this evening, which is compile the aggregate of trivia that you can pull, you don't really get a true sense of what you're looking at. As an example, the 23 phenomenon is as deep as you want it to go. It is absolutely, I could have filled a book just full of it. In fact, I'm surprised no one has filled an entire multi-hundred page book full of 23 trivia, just because there's that many things.
This reading is from a novel in progress entitled Cities of the Red Night. Some of these mutations are favorable and some otherwise. A top government official bluntly warned, virus B23, now loose in our overcrowded cities, is an agent that produces biologic changes in those affected, fatal in many cases, permanent and hereditary in those who survive and become carriers for that strain.
Let's get into that. That's going to be our main focus tonight, the 23 Enigma, as sort of prophesied by William S. Burroughs. He wrote a short story about it, 23 Skidoo. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of the number 23? Sure. Where it began, how it kind of started out, how it would come to influence other people like Robert Anton Wilson.
Absolutely. Now, we'll start easy. 23 Skidoo comes from, and this is verified by Burroughs and other people from the time period. It goes back to before World War I, into, people simply call it the 1900s. I've heard some people say as early as 1903. And there used to be, and I believe there still is actually, a little town near Death Valley, California called Skidoo. And supposedly, the story goes that there was a misprinted road sign. That instead of it saying the name of the town and then the number of miles, it said the number of miles and then the town. And so it said 23 Skidoo on it.
Oh,
instead
wow.
of Skidoo 23, like you would normally see. Now, the reason that this became part of the vernacular and the lexicon of Americanisms is to see that sign, that meant that you were in bumfuck nowhere. Absolutely. It meant you were lost, basically. And so 23 Skidoo, its original meaning meant to get lost or to go off the rails or outside the lines. And it eventually morphed into meaning to leave, and also later on meant simply to have a good time, to party. A 23 Skidoo was a shindig. It was a happening. But those meanings all shifted over a period of about 30 years, and they meant different things. But by World War I, it was on people's tongues. They were saying it, and if you said it to somebody, they may think that you meant something different than what you would have intended from the 21st century, but they would have known the saying at least. It's just kind of a funny thing. Now, Burroughs knew this, and he also did some road trips, and apparently he saw that sign before. He said in some interview that I listened to, a buddy of mine used to have this suitcase that was called something like Nothing Left But the Recordings, I believe. And it was all kinds of very obscure cut-ups, interviews, and odds and ends from Burroughs recordings, all those cassettes that he supposedly made over the years.
Oh, that would have been amazing to listen to.
It was quite the box set. I remember that even back many years ago that it was pretty damn expensive.
Yeah.
Back when like box sets were these enormous 12 by 12 things, and it was a lot of material. It was a lot of material. But I've yet to see it anytime recently. I'd probably shell out the cash for that one.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to get into some 23 trivia.
How did it all begin, first of all? So we talked about 23 Skidoo, but how did, let's talk about the experience with Captain Clark.
Yeah, now Captain Clark was in Tangiers, and when Burroughs and Geisen were over there for the boys and the hashish.
Yeah.
And there's a famous song that supposedly immortalizes a conversation they had in a cafe, in which Captain Clark explains some weird 23 story that he had heard about a ship with the number 23 on it, and the ship's captain 23 years at sea, and 23 members went down with the ship when it sank, and how this all happened on the 23rd, and how he had saved the newspaper clipping and what a strange thing this was. And supposedly this was one of the earliest times that anybody pointed it out. The thing that's strange is that it's always been there. The historical, biological, geographical stuff has always been there. Just nobody ever collected it all and said, hey, isn't this odd?
Yeah.
But people that were used to looking at things in a different sort of way, such as the beatniks, who were just basically looking to break rules the same way Picasso was, just with writing and other forms of art, happened to notice this and just thought it was a little strange, especially through the filter of them taking various early on psychedelic drugs, as well as the other things that they were taking that were, altering the way that they looked at life, basically, in their philosophy.
Yeah.
Burroughs and Geisen and Ginsberg and all the other ones really lived between their own ears, if you think about it. So much of what they did was for philosophical reasons and not for necessarily for the practical reasons of life, all the time. What I've always found strange more than anything else is just how deep the subject goes, because in science, there's something called the confirmation bias. And many people that are skeptical of the 23 phenomenon write it off as that, saying, if I shifted my focus to a different number, say 16, that I would suddenly start seeing the number 16 everywhere. The thing is when you actually do that, it doesn't happen. There are a very short list of numbers, and this is why many mystery religions, as well as established ones, find them to be special, because there's a very short list of numbers that pop up in this way.
That have that power?
Right. 23, I feel, and maybe I'm wrong, is one of the most powerful ones. I like the term current that is often used to refer to it nowadays. The 23 current, they call it. And this is that tendency among things when they have no tendency to just gravitate towards the number 23. For example, everyone nowadays knows the story of how the moon is supposedly made. A rogue astrological body, I believe they named her Theta, smacked in to the Earth and knocked off a big chunk of it way back when, and is the reason that we are tilted at 23.5 degrees.
Oh, wow.
Prior to that, we were pretty much straight up and down. So the reason that we have seasons is because of a 23, because of a catastrophe that knocked us off. Unrelated to this are the 23,000 year cycles that our planet is on as far as its climate goes, because there is a wobble within a wobble. We're not just tilted 23 degrees, but over a period of 23,000 years, our distance from the sun wobbles a little bit and causes things like cooling and warming. Unfortunately, the current warming trend that we're going through is 1,000 times faster than it should be. And that's why they believe that it is human related, seeing as it suddenly ramped up right about the time that we started producing stuff.
Yeah.
However, this cycle is still going on and will go on regardless of what we do about climate change. Unfortunately, it's not going to save or damn us. It just is happening. As a side note, as a strange thing, now I realize that kilometers, feet, inches, cubits, and whatnot are sort of arbitrary units, but it is strange because of the ratio, I guess, involved, that on the planet Mars, the closest moon is 23,500 miles away, which is strangely the same as our
Same as us.
tilt.
Yeah.
As a side note and as a consequence of this is why the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn are basically where the equator moves to over the course of the year. You know, it fluctuates up and down. Now, if you want to get on a much smaller level, without getting too new agey, if you've ever heard of Wilhelm Fleiss's biorhythms.
No.
Now, this is kind of a thing that took off in the 70s. This guy figured out that our bodies have cycles also, the same as the moon does. Same, you can use menstruation as an example, but our bodies have cycles within them, cycles within cycles. And he noticed some cycles, and he called them biorhythms. And biorhythms have to do with your physical, intellectual, and spiritual peaks and troughs. You know, kind of like in astrology, how you sort of have good days and bad days. And this tries to sort of explain this. Anyway, biorhythms run on a 23-day cycle. You have three attributes, and they will run on a 23, 46, and 69-day cycle, which is 1, 2, and 3 times 23. And these things begin when you're born, and everybody's biorhythms are a little different. It's an interesting thing. You should look yours up. I'm sure there's an online calculator that'll show you where you're at. And if you start to track your biorhythms to when you have these peaks and troughs, you may notice that they correlate to good and bad days that you have. And it's kind of interesting. I tracked mine for a long time. And although I don't necessarily pretend to understand exactly what's going on, the fact that it's predictable and trackable is very interesting because it seems to have some accuracy to it. Now, of course, everyone knows that 23 chromosomes are contributed by each parent, and it is the 23rd chromosome that decides what sex, gender, plumbing you're going to have, basically. It also coincidentally takes approximately 23 seconds for all of your blood to circulate through your body, assuming that you're reasonably healthy.
Wow.
You may have heard of the birthday anomaly. This is one that I would love to test, actually, but I don't know if I could. So, according to a mathematician who was not obsessed with the number 23, but just happened to notice this, that at the number of 23, if you have 23 people in a room, there will always be a higher than 50% chance that 2 of those people will have the same birth date.
Interesting.
This percentage goes down when you raise or lower the number of people in the room, which kind of defies logic. You would think more people in the room, higher chance.
Yeah.
That is generally what happens. It remains the same or it goes down, they found, when they actually tested it. And I would love to do this with 100 people, I guess. You know, just randomly throw them together in groups of 23 and see how often that happens. Because it's supposed to happen about 55% of the time that the people have the exact same birthday. Speaking of dates, let's do a couple of those.
Yeah.
Shakespeare, whether you believe he wrote the plays or not, the fellow that we call Shakespeare was born today. Today is Shakespeare's birthday. He was born 4/23/1616. JFK was killed at 46. Assassinated, that's 23 times 2. His birthday is 5/29. 5/29 is the square root of 23. Julius Caesar, according to historical accounts of the time, was stabbed 23 times. As a further Roman side note, the original Latin alphabet had 23 letters in it. Later, we added 3 over time. One of those letters is the 23rd letter, W, which the way that it is written in the Latin alphabet is a combination of 2 points and 3 points. One last little historical thing, if you want something more modern. Flight 800 that crashed leaving, was that New York, Chicago? Anyway, that plane crash killed 230 people. John Dillinger, the famous bank robber, robbed 23 banks. That is not entirely true, though. In my research, it turns out he actually robbed 27 banks, but he only robbed 23 for money. The other ones he robbed for other reasons, in order to destroy documents for some reason, or for, well, that was the only reason that I saw. But he apparently robbed 23 banks for money and then robbed some other ones for other reasons. Now, a lot of the trivia that I come across have to do with the numerology of 23, and that people like to add dates together, sort of like what I just did with JFK. You know, he was, born on the square root of 23. Kurt Cobain, supposed spokesperson for my generation, which I could do an entire rant on how that's not true, was born in 1967. If you add those digits together, they equal 23. He died in 1994. If you add those digits together, they also equal 23.
Wow.
Charles Manson was born on November 12th, which is 11 plus 12. 11 and 12 is 23. Harpo Marx was born the same day, but a different year. Well, actually, no, he was born November 23rd, 1888. This is a strange thing. Let's see, some more weird ones. Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down on May 23rd. Just as a historical note.
Seems like there's a lot of death and tragedy and massacre that goes on in correlation with the number 23.
Well, its gematria has to do with chaos and the current of life, sort of like I would call it Murphy's Law almost. And this is one reason why people like Discordians, chaos magicians, worshippers of Eris, etc., gravitate towards this number.
Yeah.
That would also explain why Ra was so into it as well. A strange, rather positive thing is the calendar that the ancient Egyptians were on was quite different from our Gregorian calendar, but nearest estimates say that the day that they considered to be New Year's was July 23rd, 723.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I was going to ask you about gematria. Do you have prepared or know off the top of your head any
correspondences?
Send out correspondences in Hebrew or
I
English.
do know a few things. Now, if we do the Abrahamic religions, let's start with Judaism. Of course, every letter has a number. And if you know your Hebrew, it is made up of 22 letters. However, there is, and this could be confirmed, I'm sure I should have written down the name and exact address of it, but there is an ancient Hebrew myth, we'll call it, that there is a lost 23rd letter to the Hebrew alphabet.
Interesting.
And that when the aeon changes, or in some traditions, when the Messiah comes, this letter will be revealed. And when it is revealed, it will change the entire meaning of the Torah, they say.
That reminds me too. You talk about the 22 paths on the tree of life, but then there's the hidden sphere too of Deoth. So maybe that could be looked at as like a 23rd.
Well, there would be a path to there. Yes, there would, because if you add Daith, that bisects one of the paths. And so, yeah, you add a path. The 23rd path, though, is from Hod to Gabora. And I'm trying to remember which tarot card that is off the top of my head. I'm afraid I must have lost that piece of knowledge right now.
Yeah, me too.
But to get back to the Abrahamic religions, so we have in Judaism a mystical missing letter. Now, when we get to Christianity, there are a few, but one of the ones that I found most interesting is I bet you could guess off the top of your head what the most quoted, rewritten, and written about section of the Bible is. And that is the 23rd Psalm, which is
the
shepherd. Yeah, exactly. I won't recite it now, but that bit.
Often read at funerals.
Often read at funerals, often parodied by me. Yes. But that is the most quoted portion of the Bible, which is kind of funny because it isn't even about the Jesus bit.
Yeah.
Which just goes to show what I've always said, which is the prequel is the better, the better half of the book. Now, when we get to Islam, it's even more cut and dry. Now, without debating whether or not Muhammad existed, which I would love to debate, according to tradition, it took him 23 years to receive all of the Quran and for him to write it all down, which is amazing because he was illiterate. But he supposedly learned to read and write and received and wrote down the entire Quran over a period of 23 years.
Wow.
So it's kind of strange that this 23 current has been appropriated into most aspects of Western culture, really.
Yeah.
Now, in Eastern culture, let's say in China, for example, the number 8 is a much more powerful number. And prime numbers don't tend to hold the same significance that they do. They tend to like symmetry in ancient China, whereas the Greeks, the Romans, and the so-called Middle East, they tend to like the anomalies, especially the Arabs. They love prime numbers, they love square roots, all that kind of stuff, which is probably one of the reasons that they incorporated 23 into their story of how the Quran was created. Mm-hmm. Also in Hebrew, the 42 letter name of God has a geometric value of 230, which is just sort of like the exalted version of 23. They multiply things by 10 or 100 to make them more important, basically.
Yeah, or sometimes 11 also. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes 11. They love that symmetry when all the numbers line up or all the same or straight flush. Yeah. There is a 23-sided figure called an icosystragon that apparently people do sacred geometry with. I was going to plug one into Photoshop and see what I could do with it just by arranging it and lining up the various points on it to see if it created any interesting patterns. In my head, I can sort of see how it probably would, if you had enough copies of it, create, like chrysanthemum flowers and things like that, which I would not be surprised at all if some flowers or other plants fractalized out at 23, since it's the 9th prime number. The 5th fractal prime, which means that it fractals out. So it's very interesting that way.
Yeah. It's sort of like encompasses the universe, that number, in many ways.
In many ways. So now I kind of come to a little bit of a point that I try to make with this, which is, what is this knowledge worth? What can you do with all this trivia that you shove in your head about the number 23? How is it useful in a practical manner? Because you can learn all kinds of funny stuff. I mean, Hitler had a shoe size, but what good does that do you?
Yeah.
But, and to this is one reason I would like to circle back to the Temple of Psychic Youth, which one of their crowning achievements, I guess, And one of the things that I think that they should be remembered for above all else is their exploration and experimentation with use of the number 23 and the sigil rituals that they created. Anyone that is familiar with the temple might know that in order to join, you had to do a series of 23, usually Austin Spare inspired sigil rituals of a personal variety. They called it the sigil of 3 liquids, in which case you created personalized sigils and charged them in using some threshold experience, frequently sex, but sometimes pain or endurance. You know, there are lots of ways to charge a sigil as a method of self-initiation. And I used to say, and I still believe, that you can't do that without reprogramming and changing yourself. And the nice thing that I liked about this, and one of the reasons I think it's amazing, is because unlike many cults that groom, indoctrinate, and create their members in their own likeness, the temple encouraged you to experiment and to try to figure it out for yourself. And so the accruement of knowledge that was created among the members is unparalleled. I still believe that. People that were involved in the temple know more about sigil magic than anyone. And that's a hill I think I'll die on, because unlike many people who maybe dabbled in it, these are people that made it the core of their self-initiation into the occult, as well as a practical method for honest engagement with the self-conscious, you know, whether you believe that you were contacting, you know, spirits outside, or you were reprogramming the metacomputer, you know, in the form of the way John Lilly used to talk about it. It didn't really matter too much because the techniques work so well. One thing I think that's lost or perhaps shunned right now is I don't see a lot of new ground trying to be being broken by magicians. I see a lot of people running over the same old ground, the same old techniques.
Yeah. A lack of originality.
Yes. And a lack of daring to a certain extent. I've always felt that magic can take a lot of different forms, and that guys wearing robes with daggers and wands is really pretty low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
Whereas whenever I see what the ex-members of survival research laboratories are up to nowadays, and even what ex-members of psychic bands, whether they be, you know, ex-members of Current 93 or whoever you want to name. I love seeing them actually like pushing forward and, like, you know, doing something different, you know, and in some ways hopefully inspiring people. But it's too bad that I see so many people just resting on their laurels.
Yeah.
The temple used to have a great collection of proverbs, and I wish that all of them had been collected in one place at one time, but I don't think that ever happened. I saw some pretty long lists. One of the ones that I used to like and still occasionally quote to people is that if you find yourself back at square one, you never left.
Interesting.
So if you find yourself doing the same old things that you've always done or that others have always done, don't expect yourself to advance.
You're stuck in the same place.
Yes. And this is one reason why I think, although chaos magic as a word has gotten somewhat stale, I do think that out there are people that still understand that in order to break new ground, you have to break things. And that a mess and a noise and a little wildness is actually necessary in order to do these things. I think that 23 in particular, both mystically on paper as well as in actual application, embodies this in the sense that it is the chaotic current, more so than any other ones. The OTO, of course, is particular to the number 93, and we could talk at length about the number 93 as much as the number 23. It's not quite the same current by any means, but they are similar.
It's a whole different story.
It really is, and it's a little less crazy.
Yeah.
And I still am of the opinion that it takes a little bit of inhumanness, otherness, weirdness in order to effectuate real magic of any kind, or to really change things in any way. You got to get a little bit crazy in order to do things properly.
Yeah, you have to break the rules, and you have to look beyond the confines of just everyday living, everyday life.
With that all said, however, that doesn't mean that you can just start from zero and create the wheel from scratch. An example I like to give is Pablo Picasso is considered to be one of the most unusual artists of the 20th century. However, many people do not realize he was an expert artist in the sense that he could draw a portrait of you with photographic accuracy. He chose Cubism. He was an expert at doing normal art and professional at breaking the rules, which is why people loved his stuff so much, because he broke the rules so well. Salvador Dali would be another good example of this.
Yeah.
And then later on, one of my heroes, Andy Warhol, who as an artist broke all the rules. He didn't even make the art that he signed.
I believe Crowley had a great quote that sums that up pretty well, and I would just be paraphrasing it, but it was something along the lines of, you have to break all the rules, but the key to that is learning them perfectly first.
Yes, this is exactly right. This is what Picasso said. And I wouldn't be surprised if Crowley was quoting Picasso, because they were contemporaries. And I do not know if they ever met, but I do know they lived near each other. So I would not be surprised if these two celebrities had met at some time, and that would have been one hell of a tea party.
Oh, yeah.
But it's true. You have to be an expert at the rules in order to break them expertly. This is absolutely true. I guess that's why I have no shame in studying traditional painting, even though the artwork that I produce tends to be very chaotic. You know, I study the techniques and then execute them in a chaotic method, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was growing up, I was more or less classically trained in music, but these days I find myself making more and more just kind of experimental music. So.
Obviously, yeah. But you have to understand music from a proper standpoint in order to understand how to still make it music and not just, I don't know, a noise, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, there's a genius to taking elements of noise, but putting some real musicality into it. And I think that's how it comes out best.
Oh, a side note of 23 trivia that I didn't share. You may have heard that some ardent Christians believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old.
Right. Creationism.
Creationism, sure. Several people have calculated how old the earth is based on the Bible, and that's how they came up with that number. I want to say it's it's a really exact number, actually, but it's roughly 6,000 years ago. the thing that I mentioned that has to do with 23 is when they calculated out what day it was when Genesis 1 happened. It was October 23rd.
That's what they calculated?
Yes.
Interesting.
So, according to the Bible, the world began on October 23rd, 4004 BC.
Interesting. That's a day worth celebrating for creationists, I suppose.
Yeah. And I found that I'll just have to take their word for it. I've been hearing that for many years. I've seen how messed up our Gregorian calendar is and how they had to reset that one a couple times. So I just have to take their word for it. I think they're off, period. So
they're off a little bit.
Yeah, I think they're just off. My favorite proof for that being the decay rate of lead. That's very measurable, and the fact that lead exists kind of proves that the Earth is older than 4,000 years.
Oh, I know. I know that one of their biggest arguments is that carbon dating is all off. It's all wrong. But it's a bunch of bullshit. I actually had a teacher at my high school who got in big trouble because she was trying to teach creationism to her environmental science class, which I was in, and it was interesting because I got to learn about what these wackos believe. But yeah, she got fired big time. I think sued also.
That's funny. It's very strange. I hadn't looked into the 23 phenomenon in several years, of course. This isn't something I focus on all that much lately. But it was endless. Like the books that I have in the library still, as well as what the internet was able to provide to me, was I could have, like I said, I could write a book, and maybe I should.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. How about like speaking personally? Have you had like over the years throughout your life, have you had like personal connections to the number 23? Have you had like
Yes, that's something we definitely should speak about. So the number 23 extends beyond these historical, biological, geographical, philosophical, whatever bits of trivia, in the sense that William S. Burroughs once said that language is a virus.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree. There's actually some biological substantiation for this, in the sense that they believe that the speech patterns of the brain evolved due to a mutation caused by an illness.
Wow. Interesting.
At least that's the theory, according to people with way more letters after their names than I have. I'll have to believe them. I don't know that much about brain anatomy to say no, but they seem to feel that there is substantial evidence that that's what caused the change, because of what the change is. They can infer that that this was caused by a viral infection. With all that, basically, the 23 phenomenon is a language virus. You could say that language is the carrier wave, almost like how an FM radio station works, and that the hearing of the phenomenon of the 23 anomalies is how the virus is spread. So, in a way, by listening to this, you are being infected by the 23 virus. This is how members of the Temple of Psychic Youth and others got this curse that they believe they have. To answer your question more directly, absolutely yes, in the sense that not only have things in my life revolved around the number 23, such as when I got married and things like that, but also things that I have no control over, for example, if you start to look for it, you start to notice, and this, like I said, it's beyond confirmation bias. It's the number starts to pop out at you. You know, you get paid, and your paycheck is check number 23, and the change is 23 cents. Or your number when you go to Taco Bell is order 23. Your change is 23 cents. Like it starts to pile up to the point to where you can't shrug it off as mere coincidence or merely you noticing this one number. In fact, you can then go the opposite direction and try to ignore it and only see it more.
Mm-hmm.
And so to answer your question, I can't even begin to list out the number of 23s that have happened in my life. It is an ongoing current, because once you have the curse, just as people as diverse as members of TOPY or even old bloody Jim Carrey, who also has the curse, he has talked about it at length. And of course, there's that movie. There's also a German movie about the phenomenon as well. Which both of them just sort of scratch the surface a little bit. But it's just a common thing that runs through everybody's lives. I mean, once you have it, you almost have to try to ignore it in order for it to not pop out at you, for it not to like sort of
overwhelm you. Yeah. Have you gone
through? There is something, though, that I like to interject. There's a lot of people have come to me and said, well, if that's true, how come you can't use it to your benefit? The old how come psychics don't win the lottery argument, right? And unfortunately, as I said before, it's a bit like Murphy's Law in the sense that you don't have that kind of power over it, except that anytime it can happen, it will. So you can, if you like, bet on that number. And chances are it'll come up. Not that you'll win the lottery, but let's say you go to the casino and you're like, damn it, I'm going to put $230 on 23 black. And damn if it doesn't come up 46 black. Or 69 black. Or some multiple of 23. Like a dozen times in a row on you or something, you know, like beyond credibility. And so I have tried to do that on occasion. Just be like, okay. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but it isn't the sort of thing that you have that kind of control over. All I can tell people to do is if you believe in it, go ahead and try it, because chances are higher that it will work out. But when it doesn't, that doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
Any more than it does when it does work out, I guess, except that it was mathematically more probable.
It's as random and chaotic as the universe itself.
Yeah, it's sort of like whether your toast lands jelly face down. I mean, it seems like it always happens, but truthfully, you only remember the times that it happens. The times that things work out well for you, you tend not to hold on to, because bad news travels further, and that's true inside your brain also. And confirmation tends to travel further also. So you'll notice the 23s more than you'll notice the times that it didn't come up, I guess.
Have you gone through periods in your life where you felt like there was so much synchronicity with the number 23 that like you were almost going kind of mad, or at least you found yourself surprised, shocked?
Yes, and at times when I was heavily into the occult and practicing a great deal, you could say, you know, like actively practicing and doing rites and trying techniques and things like this, that's when you really start to notice the current, and yeah, it becomes very prevalent. I always took it as a positive note since it was a sacred number. It wasn't some kind of unlucky thing or anything like that. And so when it came up more, I figured it meant I was on the correct path, and I took it as encouragement, I guess, from the universe.
Yeah.
I don't really know another way to use it, because fearing it, which I have seen people do, doesn't really seem to benefit anybody. It's not like it's something you can really easily avoid once you have the curse. I don't really know of a way to get rid of it, except that you can simply ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist, which I've done that for years at times, only to glance and notice that it's all around me still. And I was just, not paying attention to it,
Yeah. I guess you can stop paying attention. I guess that's about the best you can do.
And the fact that that's true, or appears to be true, lends validity to the phenomena being something more than mental illness or a trick, of life. The fact that you don't have control over it and it exists outside of your realm of influence, and yet it still reaches in and touches you from time to time.
Yeah.
I actually think that it's a pretty good thing. Of course, if you look up on the internet having to do with the phenomenon, you'll see lots of things about Michael Jordan. He had a thing for the number. So did the, what was his name? Graham Nash? No, something Nash. The guy from A Brilliant Mind that...
Okay.
He was obsessed with the number 23 because of the way that it presented itself in mathematics, because he was a mathematician, of course. And he just couldn't believe that this single number stood out so much. And he did all kinds of proofs upon it. In fact, when I was doing the research for the show, the math got a little beyond my knowledge, because I couldn't quite understand the calculus that he was doing.
Yeah.
That was expressing the 23 fractal. And I was like, wow, that's really neat, but I didn't quite understand it. I need to have somebody explain it to me a little bit more. I understand, the biorhythms and that sort of stuff a little bit more, and obviously the historical things are kind of neat, but the fact that it goes so much deeper kind of shows that there is something there.
Yeah. Something
more than just trivia.
There's something that's so deep, like we can't quite penetrate it. There's like, it's like this underlying phenomenon that we can't fully understand, perhaps, or maybe not in this dimension or in this sphere.
It's true. It almost, and this might be a little new agey, but it almost seems as though numbers can have personality or intelligence to them, and that certain numbers behave in a certain way. And by behave, I don't necessarily mean how they multiply out. It's more like how they behave in the sense that they exist more often than they should, or they interject themselves in unusual places where they wouldn't normally be expected.
Yeah. There's something very, very sacred about numbers. Absolutely.
Thanks again to our guest, Michael Magickman, for joining us, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in. This is the Emerald Doorway Podcast. You have entered the Emerald Doorway, and now there's no turning back. The only way is to move forward. Next week, we have Sean Woodward, a wonderful artist, occultist, author, comic book artist, musician. He is a member of the OTOA LCN, and he will be joining us to discuss Lemurian magic, among many, many other things. Stay tuned in, and thank you for listening.